welcome to this lecture where we're going to be building our calculator app. And to build this calculator software, we're going to use something called the Tkinter package in Python. Tkinter is a standard GUI library in Python, and GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. Python, when combined with Tkinter, provides a fast and easy way to create desktop applications for Windows, Mac, and even Linux. The Tkinter module includes various controls such as buttons, labels, and even text boxes used in an application. And these controls are going to be called widgets throughout the course of these lessons. Again, creating a GUI application using Python and Tkinter is an easy task. So, before we begin, all I want you to do right now is to hit the like and subscribe button. And without any further ado, let's get started. So, inside my programs folder, I'm going to create a new Python file. Let's call it calculator.py and then hit enter. So, the first thing I'm actually going to do is to import our Tkinter module. I'm going to say from Tkinter import star. And you might be wondering about this star here. And what this means is that the import star statement imports all the attributes and methods inside our Tkinter module. So for example, if we say from Tkinter import button, in this case, we are importing button differently into our Python file. So to avoid this, all you need to do is to say from Tkinter import star, meaning the star is going to import all the elements inside our Tkinter module. So in this case, we don't have to do that manually every time you want to access elements from the Tkinter module. So the next thing I'm going to say is win equals to tk and then win.mainloop. So let's actually run the code. As you can see, we actually get an empty application window. So the tk function here creates an instance of the Tkinter, which is our application window right here. And here on the third line where we execute the main loop method is what keeps our application visible. So we want to make sure that we keep the main loop running until we press the close button, which exits the main loop. So I can also say win.title and then pass in the string calculator. And when I run the code, then we can see that our application window name has been changed to calculator. Again, we also have win.geometry. Then I'm going to pass in the size 515 times 365 and also run the code. Now we can see that the size of our app window has been modified. So we use the win.geometry function to give the size of our application window. Though we have a defined size window for our application, but we can actually increase the size of our application window like this. And in the case of our calculator app, we actually don't want to increase the size of the window. So to avoid that, I'm simply going to say win.resizable and then pass in the value 0, comma, again another 0. And when I run the code, then we can see that we can't actually increase or decrease the window size of our application. And also, the maximize button is disabled. So that's pretty much the basis of creating application window in Tkinter. Now, let's start building our calculator software. First, we're going to start by creating the input field of the calculator. So I'm going to create something called a frame, and inside the frame is where we're going to add our input field. So I'm going to call the frame function, and in between the parentheses I'm going to pass in our window object, which is win. Then give our frame a width value of 312 and a height value of 50. And we're going to set all of this into a variable called input_frame. Then finally, we're going to say input_frame.pack. And then in between the parentheses, we're going to pass in side equals to top. Now that we've actually created a frame for our input field, which is located inside our window object, so now we're going to create our input field inside our frame. To do that, we're going to call the entry function. And then in between the parentheses, I'm going to pass in input_frame. So we are now creating an entry field inside our input frame. And input frame is being created inside our window. Then we're going to add a comma and pass in font equals to a tuple. Then we're going to give a font type of our choice. Let's say Arial. Then the font size of 18. We're going to say bold. Again, I'm going to add a comma and then give a width value of 45, comma, and then justify equals to right. Then we're going to store everything in a variable called input_field. Then finally, we're going to say input_field.grid. Then in between the parentheses, I'm going to pass in the row equals to 0 and then a colon also equals to 0. So let's actually run the code. So as you can see, here is our input field for our calculator, and we can add some couple of text inside. So let's actually increase the height of the input field. But before that, we're going to create a comment. I'm going to call it increase the height of input field. Then I'm going to say input field.pack. Then I'm going to pass in iPad y equals to the value 10. So the iPad here creates an internal padding to increase the height of our input field. So let's run the code and see that in action. As you can see, the height of our input field has been increased. So let's now start creating the buttons for our calculator. And the first thing we're going to do is to create a frame also for the buttons. So I'm going to add a comment and call it button frame. And let's actually add a comment for our input frame also. So I'm going to say input field frame. And back to our button frame section, let's now create a frame for our buttons. So I'm going to call the frame function, and then inside the parentheses, the first argument is going to be where we want to add our frame. Again, it's going to be the window object, which is win. Then a comma, and then I'm going to add a width to our frame and set it to the value 310, comma, and then a height value of 270. So I'm going to set our frame to a variable called buttons frame. And finally, we're going to say buttons frame.pack. So now that we've created the frame for our calculator buttons, let's now start adding the individual buttons. The first couple of buttons will be for the first row of our calculator app. So I'm going to say button, and this button is going to be inside our buttons frame, then a comma, and then we're going to say text and set it to the string C, which is the value for our button. Then I'm going to give a width for our button, which we're going to say 38, and also height equals to the value 3. Finally, we're going to add .grid at the end of our button function. The first thing we're going to pass in is the row for our button, which is 0, comma, and then the column, which is also 0. So the row and the column is used to position our button inside the app. Then we're going to add a comma and then column span equals to 3, which is going to be the amount of columns that our button is going to occupy. Then a comma and then pad x equals to 1, and also pad y equals to 1. So the pad x and the pad y is going to give us a little spacing outside the borders of our button. So let's store all of these in a variable called clear. And when I actually run the code, then here is our button at the center of our app, which is pretty awesome, right? Now let's actually create our second button. So I'm gonna call the button function and then pass in the button's frame, comma, and text is gonna be the division symbol, comma, and then size of the width is gonna be 10. Also, the height is gonna be 3. Then we're gonna add the grid method, and then row equals to 0, comma, then column is gonna be 3, and comma, then we're just gonna pass in pad x equals to 1, and also pad y equals to 1. Finally, we're going to store everything in a variable called divide. And when I run the code, then here is our button created inside our app. Now, let's actually start creating the buttons on the second row of our app. So, I'm going to add a comment, let's say button second row. Then create our first button. We're going to say button and then pass in the button's frame, comma, then for the text, I'm going to set it to the value 7, then a comma, then for the width, I'm going to set it to the value 10, another comma, then height equals to 3. Finally, we're going to add .grid. Then our row value is going to be 1, and then column is going to be the value 0, comma, then for pad x, I'm going to set it to the value 1, comma, then pad y is also going to be 1. Then all you need to do now is to store all of these in a variable called 7. And let's run our code and have a look for our app. And here is our button of the value 7 inside our calculator. So let's now add other couple of buttons on the second row. To do that, I'm just going to copy our button and then paste it right below here. Then change the value of our text to 8. Again, the value of our column from 0 to 1. Finally, I'm also going to store everything in a variable. Let's say 8. Again, I'm going to paste our next button. This time, the value of text is 9. Then, the value of column is 2. Then also, store everything in a variable. Let's call it 9. Finally, I'm going to paste the last button for our second row. And the value of text is going to be the multiplication symbol. Then, the value of column is 3. Then finally, store everything in a variable called multiply. Now, let's run the code and have a look for our app. So, here we have our buttons 7, 8, 9, and then the multiplication button. Now, let's start adding the buttons for our third row of the app. So, I'm going to add a comment. Let's call it button third row. Then, I'm going to paste the button that we copied earlier. So for the value of text, I'm going to say 4. Then This time around, the value of row is going to be 2. And for column, it's going to be the value 0. Then we're going to store all of this in a variable called 4. And when I run the code, then we have our button with the number 4 on the third row of our app. So let's actually add the rest of the buttons. I'm going to paste our button, then change the value of text to 5. And for the value of column, it's going to be 1. Then store everything in a variable. Let's call it 5. Then I'm going to paste another button. Again, change the value of text to 6. And also for column, it's going to be the value 2. Then store all of this in a variable called 6. Once again, I'm going to paste another button. Also, change the value of text to minus symbol. And then for the value of column, it's going to be 3. And then store everything in a variable. Let's call it minus. And when I run the code, then here we have our button 4, 5, 6, and minus inside our app. Now we're going to start adding the buttons for the 4th and 5th row of the app. So I'm going to create a comment. Let's say button 4th row. I'm going to paste my button. Then I'm going to paste another one. Again, add another button and another one once again. So our 4th row is going to have 4 buttons and the value of text is going to be 1. And for the second button here, it's going to be 2. Then the third button here is 3. And then for the 4th button, it's going to be the plus symbol. And we're going to change the value of row for the buttons. So all the values is going to be 3. And for the column, the first button is going to be 0. Then the second button 1. Then 2. And the last button is going to be 3. And finally, we're going to store all our buttons in a separate variable. So the first button is going to be 1. Then for the second button, it's going to be 2. And for the third button, it's going to be 3. And finally, the last button is going to be plus. So let's run the code and have a look for our app. As you can see, here we have our button of 1, 2, 3, and then the plus button. So for the final section on the interface, we're going to add the button for the last row of the app. So I'm going to create a comment which goes button 5th row and then paste our button. Again, I'm going to add another button and also the last one. So our last row for the calculator app is going to have 3 buttons. So for the text, the first button is going to have the value 0. Then the second button is going to have the decimal symbol. And finally, the last button is going to be the equal symbol. So for the value of row, all the values is going to be set to 4. Also for the second button and then the last button. And for the column, we're going to give the value 0 for the first button and then 2 and finally 3 for the third button. Again, for our first button, I'm going to say column span and set it equals to 2, which is going to take extra space than the second and the third button. Then I'm going to increase the width value to 24. Finally, I'm going to store everything in a variable called 0. Then for the second button, I'm going to name it point. And finally, the third button is going to be inside the variable equal. So let's run our code and have a look. Alright, here is our calculator app interface completed. Now, if you are curious and want to learn more about building app interface with Python and Tkinter, I'm actually planning a course dedicated to just doing that. So, make sure you hit the subscribe button to get notified for more of my courses in the future. And on that note, we've come to the end of this tutorial, and in the next lecture, we're going to be adding the functionalities for our calculator software by doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division of numbers. So, I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.